Hello everybody. I'm sorry I haven't been posting very much lately. That's mainly, well, it's two things. One is I've been rather busy with lots of other things, and also the light has been really bad for this rather pathetic camera on my computer. I don't know if I may have mentioned it in passing in some of my postings, but if I haven't, I'll mention it now, which is that I live on a narrowboat around Oxford. That's a kind of traditional, very long, narrow canal boat we have in the UK. It depends on where I am. The light, I have to use artificial light. I have to use natural light for this camera, at this time of year, the sun is so low and the light is so bad, and it's been overcast, that it makes it very difficult to actually do any videos. The lighting inside, the electric lighting inside the boat isn't adequate. Anyway, I'm sitting here by the windows at the front with a different perspective from usual, I just thought what I'd do this time is I think I'm going to start a new thing on here, which I'm going to have a kind of every so often I'm going to do a video about my current reading. As I've mentioned before, I read an awful lot. I'm a voracious reader, a voracious bookworm. When I was about 5 years old, my mother, I might have mentioned this before in a video, my mother mentioned that my brother was considered a bit of a bookworm, and I thought this was very strange. I thought it was basically calling him a kind of insect or lower form of life, but my mother explained what a bookworm was, and ever since then I've realised I am definitely a bookworm. Anyway, so this month I have been reading many different things. Amongst the area of e-books, which I've been discovering lately, I've been reading Charles Kingsley's The Water Babies, which is a very strange book. It's quite a well-known, well, it used to be quite a well-known Victorian sort of a fantasy fairy tale, I suppose, by Charles Kingsley, about a small boy who's a chimney sweep and gets treated incredibly badly, and he escapes and he falls in a river and turns into something called a water baby and has this strange kind of sub-aquatic life. I don't quite know what to make of it, actually. It's got some very peculiar overtones, like a lot of Victorian literature for children does, but it's very well written, and it's got a kind of extraordinary exotic sense of fantasy about it, which is quite fascinating, and the way he imagines living underwater and so on. And you can see behind it there's this whole idea of children in Victorian England being exploited and escaping from the terrible grime and soot into water, this kind of clean element, and becoming clean and free from sin and so on. It's got all kinds of odd religious undertones. Charles Kingsley, I believe, was a clergyman. Anyway, that's one oddity I've been reading. I've never read it before. Also, on my ebook, my ebook reader, or my Kindle, I've been finding something which I'm very into, which would probably be completely incomprehensible to many people, but there you are. I've found that you can get every single copy of a magazine or a paper called The Magnet. The Magnet was started in 1908 and it went on until 1940. It was a very, very famous, basically a boys' paper, and it's the origin of the famous, or at least at one time very famous, character Billy Bunter and his pals. You get up to all kinds of ridiculous scrapes and so on. Now, I don't expect any people who are not into this kind of thing to understand it at all, but I for the sake of nostalgia, I was very fond of Billy Bunter when I was a kid. He's probably considered totally non-PC nowadays, but I used to find it funny, and it's fascinating to me to see how it started right from the beginning in 1908, establishing the different characters and so on. So I'm very much enjoying downloading the different issues of The Magnet. They were all written by a writer called Frank Richards, who had about half a dozen other pseudonyms, and he wrote several million words in his life. He wrote for more than 50 years. He churned out these stories, not only Billy Bunter, but many other ones of a similar kind. And there was one of the funniest things of all is there was a famous altercation between Frank Richards, the author of Billy Bunter, and none other than George Orwell, the author of 1984 and Animal Farm. Orwell wrote an article in a magazine saying that he didn't believe this Frank Richards could be a real person because nobody could possibly write that many words. And anyway, he basically sort of said that anyway the stuff he wrote was awful, and it's all kind of full of ghastly cliches and imperialistic, jingoistic nonsense and so on, and it depicted a completely unreal world in which everything was nice and safe and sound as long as you were upper class and had lots of money, and you know, various things like that. And then Frank Richards wrote an article in return. These were both in the, I think it was in the Spectator or the New Statesman, one of these political magazines. Frank Richards wrote an article in return saying, well, yes, I am a real person, and I have written all these stories myself, and in fact I've written a lot of other stories as well. And then he proceeded to defend what he was writing and saying that his literature was harmless entertainment, and that in fact it was very true to life. And it's just the most bizarre confrontation between two completely different sorts of religious, sorry, not religious, why did I say religion? But between two completely different sort of literary characters. So that's The Magnet. And then, as usual, I've been reading many actual physical books, which is my wont. I've got quite an odd selection this month. I've been reading a very interesting book. Here we are, Benjamin Britten. Oh, can't see it in this light. Benjamin Britten on music. It's a collection of writings and bits of interviews and so on from the entire life of Benjamin Britten, the very famous British composer. And it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I probably mentioned on my music channel that he's one of my big influences, and it's very, very interesting to hear the kind of thing he says basically about the whole process of composing, which is what I do anyway, and also his comments on other people's music, his comments on the state of music in his time, and just accounts of the struggles he had early on to get recognised as a composer, and creating the English Opera Group, which was the first. Apart from Covent Garden, I think it might have actually been the first professional English opera company ever. And it's a very interesting book, that. So I've been enjoying that. I've got another one here, a very interesting non-fiction book called The Romans Who Shaped Britain. You probably can't see it. It's got a picture of the Emperor Hadrian on the front, I think it is. Very interesting book, all about the different people from Julius Caesar onwards, different Romans, that is, who invaded Britain. Or in other ways were involved in Britain, and the influence that they and the Romans in general had on this country. And this is something I've always been very, very interested in. When I was a kid, I used to love the books of Rosemary Sutcliffe. I've done a thing about her recently on here, and she wrote a series of books about Rome and Britain, which completely fascinated me. And I've spent a lot of time wandering around. I mean, there are Roman remains everywhere around Britain, and it is quite remarkable just how all pervasive they are, and the enormous influence Britain had. Things people don't even know about. Things like wine were grown here. Various kinds of food and so on were first introduced here. Glass windows were first introduced in Britain by the Romans. The Welsh word for window is fenestra, which is almost the same as the Latin word fenestra. So the Welsh, who are the descendants of the ancient Britons, obviously before the Romans came, they didn't have windows. So when the Romans introduced this remarkable new idea, they called it by the Latin name fenestra. Also, the edible snail, which is an interesting bit of information. If you see snails around, you do see them occasionally with striped shells. They are edible snails, and they were introduced to Britain by the Romans as well. So that's another interesting one. And then I've got this lovely book called The Oxford Book of Oxford. Now, Oxford, the Oxford University Press has published lots and lots of books. The Oxford Book of this, the Oxford Book of that, the Oxford Book of Poetry, the Oxford Book of... But this is the ultimate Oxford book, which is the Oxford Book of Oxford. And it's a collection. It's collected by Jan Morris, the famous travel writer, who also wrote a very good general guide to Oxford. And it's a collection of tidbits and information and anecdotes about Oxford over the centuries. Now, Oxford is a very remarkable place, and this is where I'm based. And one of the things I do to try to earn a pittance to keep body and soul together is I actually work as a tour guide. I do guided tours, walking tours around Oxford, and one of the tours I do is a literary tour about all the writers of people in Oxford. So this book will be very useful. I'm still learning. I've been in Oxford for 10 years now. No, more than 10 years, about nearly 14 years, and I'm still learning new stuff. Oxford is just so full of history and anecdotes, and it is a very remarkable place. It's not quite what it was some years ago. It's changed, like everywhere has changed. I don't think generally for the better, but on the other hand, it's still got a remarkable character. And then, on a completely frivolous note, I've got a very silly book here. I like reading silly books sometimes, just to lighten things up. Curiosities. It has the very unfortunate name Tossers and Arse Blowers, an alternative romp through Europe, by J.R. Dayschner. He's an American writer, and he wrote a book called True Brits, apparently, about all the eccentric customs that go on in Britain, and he followed up with this one, which is all about the eccentric customs that go on around Europe, including the baby jumping festival and the rigor mortis procession in Spain, snake handling and fire dancing in Greece, cow fighting in Switzerland, and the celebrations of England's patron saint in the heart of the EU. And he's also, and the way he's introduced into the Order of the Priceless Sardine, and catches countless characters in action, including a German detective turned love spy, the last of the Irish matchmakers, a Sicilian cop profile, I won't go into that, and a gay Turkish bear. Apparently oil wrestling in Turkey is a very macho sport, but it's extremely popular with a gay audience for some reason I can't imagine. So that's proving highly amusing. So that's a selection of the books I'm reading at the moment. You may say, well, they are very frivolous. Oh, well, I forgot also, I'm reading Arthur C. Clarke's very last novel. Arthur C. Clarke died, he was aged over 90 in 2008. Of course, he's one of the great science fiction writers, visionary figures of the 20th century, really. He lived in Sri Lanka for about the last 50 years of his life. Very sensible place to live if you can. He did a final book, a final novel called The Last Theorem, and he did it in collaboration with Poul Anderson, who's another very famous science fiction writer, who was also about 90. So it just shows that even when you get to that sort of age, you can still be very creative. And what it's about, it's to do with Fermat's Last Theorem, which was actually was sold fairly recently, and it's an obscure mathematical theorem, but it's all mixed up with this rather interesting idea that from the time we started creating nuclear explosions on this planet, they have been observed by other intelligent beings, because a nuclear explosion is bright enough to be seen light years away in space. And one particular species called the Grand Galactus have decided that a species that produces nuclear explosions on the scale that we have is a dangerous and unnecessary species, and they have sent a fleet of ships to destroy Earth and get rid of the human species. So I don't know what happens. I'm only about halfway through yet. Heaven knows what might happen at the end. And that is about it. Also, I've been slowly rereading Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, because I'm a huge Tolkien fan, and I just finished the second volume, The Two Towers, and I'm just reading it in small doses in between everything else. I don't know where I find time to read all this stuff, but as I've mentioned so many times before, I am a true bookworm, and I read 2 or 3 hours a day, and it's always been a great part of my life. And so if any of those books are of interest to you, do please like this video and subscribe, and by all means put comments and ask questions and so on about the books, and I can point you towards their authors, sources and so on. I'd be very pleased to do so. So that's December 2014, my current reading. And so goodbye for now, and I wish you all a very happy Christmas and a happy New Year when it comes.